Thank you all so much for coming out at 8 a.m. on a Sunday morning. We really appreciate it. And I hope that you start thinking about some really good questions, because we're going to have a little bit of a conversation up here, but we want to save about half the time for questions from you all. And I want to start things off because even in health crowds, I often know and have found out that folks don't know what the Surgeon General does. So I know that in a health crowd, a lot of folks really don't know what the president of the Federal Reserve Bank does. So I want to ask you, President Harker, tell us, what does the Federal Reserve do and what is your role?
So Fed 101, a quick primer, but thank you so much for being here, and for all of you for being here as well. So the Fed, as you know, the headline event is monetary policy, the interest rate setting body for the United States. But we're more than that. We're a bank. We're an unusual bank in that our clients are banks and U.S. government. We're the fiscal agent for the U.S. government. So we run a large institution in terms of banking. But also the part that people don't fully understand is our obligation within low to moderate income communities. Starting in the 1970s with the passage of the Community Reinvestment Act, CRA, we've had an obligation of supervising banks, we also regulate institutions, to make sure that they are reinvesting in the communities where they do business. That has morphed over time. Initially, it was just low-income housing. That was the easy thing, kind of low-hanging fruit for banks to invest in. But increasingly, and we're going through a rethink right now with our fellow federal regulators, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency and the FDIC, of rethinking the CRA and what could be eligible for credits. And some of those are things like, yes, housing, transit, workforce development, and increasingly health infrastructure to create a healthy community. So we, in the Feds, each one of us is specialized in different things, and I'll come back to that in a little bit, about what's going on in Philadelphia, but we all have a deep bench of experts dedicated to understanding how to help low and moderate income communities not be low moderate income communities. So let me turn and ask the same question to you. I don't know if there are any central bankers in the room. I'm probably the only one. But the U.S. Public Health Service, what is it?
Well, thank you for asking that question. Thank you for the explanation, because all I knew about the Federal Reserve Bank before I started to partner with you and your colleagues was that there were lots of movies about you all getting robbed. But we didn't want to talk about that today. But the Surgeon General is the head of the United States Public Health Service, which was actually initiated by President John Adams, the second president. We're older than the Air Force. We're one of the 7 uniformed services. And I carry the rank of Vice Admiral. Our mission is to protect, promote, and advance the health and safety of our nation. So we respond to hurricanes, to wildfires, to earthquakes, to natural disasters and health emergencies across the globe. We were the only uniformed service to provide clinical care on the ground during the last Ebola outbreak in Africa. That's one part of what the Surgeon General does. The other part is what I call the C. Everett Koop role, the nation's doctor. And in that capacity, I am the nation's chief health educator and advocate. And you know, it's been really interesting because I used to run the Indiana State Department of Health. And in that role, I had, you know, $400 million budget. I had 1,000 employees. I had the ability to move pieces around on the chessboard. But in this role, it's very different. I have the bully pulpit. And the bully pulpit can be very impactful when used appropriately, but it can only be used if you develop the partnerships and the influence to actually get folks to listen to you. And one of the challenges of this role is that, quite frankly, folks don't vote on health. You know, I often say, and the public health folks in the crowd may frown when I say this, but public health ain't that hard. Don't smoke, don't drink, move more, eat right, get your sleep. Anybody not know that before the Surgeon General got on stage? So the challenge is actually getting people to modify their behaviors. And so what I've done is really looked at why people act the way that they do, what they prioritize, what they vote on. And the number one issue people vote on in the United States, Democrat or Republican, black or white, rural or urban, consistently, is jobs in the economy. And so it's why one of my big pushes has been working with the Federal Reserve Bank, working with other business folks to figure out how we can speak in a language that resonates with folks. And I'll tell you a really quick story that I think drives home that point. I was at the U.S. Conference of Mayors. I had Mayor Bill de Blasio on one side. I had Mayor Benjamin from South Carolina on the other side, and about 50 mayors in the room. And I wanted to know what made them tick. So I asked these mayors, how many of you all ran for office on a pledge to lower your community's hemoglobin A1C rates by 15%? And I was shocked. Not a single person raised their hand. But that's the challenge. We have Aspen Ideas Festivals, and we have Robert Wood Johnson convenings, and we have National Academy of Medicine talks where all of us health folks sit in a room, and we come up with great programs that move the needle on health. And then we go out into the public and say, we've got a great program that's going to lower your hemoglobin A1C rates by 15%, but no one's out there voting or prioritizing hemoglobin A1C. They're prioritizing jobs, the economy, interest rates, and so we've got to figure out how the two of us up here can work together and show folks that when you invest in health, you see not just health benefits, but you see benefits that accrue to the community from an economic point of view.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the Philadelphia Federal Reserve. What are you all doing in this space?
So the Philly Fed has an unfortunate distinction being in Philadelphia. It's a great thing, except Philadelphia, of the top 10 cities in America, has the deepest poverty of any top 10 city. So we, over the course of several decades, have developed an expertise, and we have a major conference we do every other year called Reinventing Our Communities, where we bring together a diverse mix of people, scholars, policymakers, philanthropies, government officials, to mix it up, to come up with solutions to the kind of problems we face. We've been doing that work, as I said, for a couple of decades. A few years ago, after I got to the Philly Fed, we said, we need to really double down on this work. And it's not just Philadelphia. We have struggling old industrial communities throughout our district, Reading, Scranton, et cetera. So how do we engage them in a way that is meaningful and also stays within our mandate? I mean, the first thing they'd love for us to do is give them money. We can't do that. We can give them tons of shredded money. We have lots of that. But we can't give them full bills.
If you want a good gift, I went to the Atlanta Fed Reserve, and you can get bags of shredded money.
Yeah.
And so it's actually pretty cool for a Christmas gift.
And you can try to tape it all together. I wouldn't recommend that. So we launched what we call the Economic Growth and Mobility Project. It has 3 legs to this stool, plus one other important aspect. The 3 legs of the stool are job creation, good jobs. And this is an area we've been working with our colleagues in Atlanta and Cleveland on we call them opportunity occupations. What are the jobs in America that pay above median wages, that don't require a 4-year college degree or a 4-year college degree right away? This is going to be an unusual thing for a university president to say, a former recovering university president. Not everybody should go to a 4-year college, or at least right away. There are other pathways to careers. I'll give you one example. Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania, there's a guy with a truck repair business up there, desperate for diesel mechanics, truck mechanics. He pays them over $100,000 a year, and he can't find them. I'm going to come back to that. Second piece then is...
And the other problem is you have someone who goes to school for engineering, gets a 4-year degree, comes out, and you still have to train them up for a year, 18 months to teach them how to be a diesel mechanic.
Right. And that's why the second focus we have is on skill development, workforce development. Heavy emphasis, not just in Philadelphia, but across the system on this issue. And there, again, it's what are other pathways where people can earn and learn? Apprenticeships. Apprenticeships are no longer your grandparents' apprenticeships. They're in IT, they're in healthcare. They're coming out across the board. And then the third area that often gets overlooked in this economic development story is what we'd call broadly infrastructure. Housing, transportation, broadband access, health. If you can't get to a job, or the job can't get to you, or you can't live near the job, and you're too sick to do the job, you don't have a job. And so this issue has become, it's a two-way street for us in thinking, for me, for thinking about, oh, by the way, quickly give the Federal Reserve disclaimer. These are my thoughts, nobody else's. Now, I'm covered, I can't get in trouble. You're all my witnesses. So if you think about health in particular, it's a two-way street, right? Communities that have health challenges are going to be challenged. Conversely, employers who need those workers are challenged. And we are in a unique period in American economic history. We have more job openings than unemployed people in America, to the tune of over 1 million. We've never seen this before. So to me, this is the unique time for this country to work with employers, work with others, work with government agencies, work with us, work across the board to help solve this problem.
And I completely agree with you. We're at an inflection point in this country, and we're having to take a hard look at the way we treat and consider folks with criminal background records, folks with substance use disorder, folks who we've previously given the scarlet letter and who can't reintegrate back into society. And it's not happening from an empathetic point of view. It's happening from a financial point of view. I was with the First Lady and Secretary of Labor Acosta in Richmond, Indiana, not too long ago. And there's a company there called Belden. And they've been in this small community for 80 years. They had to interview 300 people to fill about 25 slots because they couldn't find enough people who could actually pass the drug test. And so they had to rethink the way they look at hiring. And so now, instead of having you apply, and then coming in for the first interview, and then coming in for the second interview, and then hiring you, and then finding out you failed the drug screen, they're actually drug screening up front, or asking people, do you have a substance use disorder up front? And if the people say yes or screen yes, they've partnered with the community to connect them with treatment, and if they're successful in treatment, then they save a job for them. And they found that the people who complete this program are among their most successful and loyal employees and actually miss less time from work than people who don't have a substance use disorder. And so, again, right at an inflection point, but I do want to dig into this a little bit deeper with you, because the times I've been to Philly while I've been Surgeon General have all been because of the opioid epidemic.
Right.
And help me understand how the opioid epidemic is affecting the way you all are thinking at the Federal Reserve and the impact that you see it having on businesses.
So we have a report coming out this week, next week. One of our young economists wrote on the impacts it's having on the 3rd District, our district, which is most of Pennsylvania, half of New Jersey, and all of Delaware. It's across the board. It isn't just in Philadelphia. It's in communities like Johnstown. And what's happening is, this islands of despair where people don't see an economic future. And so the epidemic is completely tied with people losing hope, right? When people become hopeless, truly hopeless, and we all know our own families and relatives who have gone through this, right? It is devastating to them, right? They can't take care of their family. They can't feed their family. They can't be there for their family. And so this issue is now really starting to bite and affect economic growth. If companies can't find the workers they need, they are turning away business. And this is what you're hearing through all our survey work, through anecdotal contacts we have, that companies are limiting growth because they can't find the people. It's not just a skills mix, but it's this issue, and this is where we need creative solutions to try to help with issues like the opioid epidemic, but other things. For example, in Northeast Pennsylvania, one of the other areas of our Economic Growth and Mobility Project is what we call research and action labs. We take a problem that we think is a canonical problem. That is a problem not just of that community, but broadly shared. Northeast Pennsylvania, Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, Hazleton area. Scranton is the city that Thomas Edison first electrifies. If you watch The Office, you'll know there's a big sign saying the electric city. A lot of low-income people living in the city. The transit systems were designed to bring people in and out of these cities. But the jobs are all out on the highway, the truck repair, warehouse, logistics jobs. So we put a team together. We partnered with the local university, Wilkes University, trained them how to do some of the analytic work, and they then convened a group, and they now have a group called NEPA Moves, Northeast Pennsylvania Moves, to solve this problem. What I like about this story is Geisinger, the main healthcare system up there, it joined in completely on this. But then a light bulb went off in their head, and they said, it isn't just about jobs. If people can't get to their appointment, if they can't get to their drug treatment program, if they can't get to whatever they need in terms of their health, not only do they lose, but actually we lose in terms of reimbursement policy. So they developed something called Appointment Navigator, and they will help somebody get there on transit. But if there's a last mile or so that they can't close by transit, they send a van, they pay for an Uber, and they've piloted this, they see this in their economic advantage to help people get the health care they need, because we're so desperate for workers. That's what I'm excited about. It's this creative thinking we're starting to see in the economy that we can multiply. Since we put this together, several other communities around the country have come to us and said, we have exactly that problem. And now we can turn a toolkit over to them, and they can solve their problem.
Well, and speaking of a toolkit, one of the signature reports that I'm working on as Surgeon General is my Community Health and Economic Prosperity Report. And it's making the case that communities that invest in health see health not see outcomes that aren't just beneficial from a health point of view and don't just accrue to the individual, but they see outcomes that accrue from a financial point of view and accrue to the community. Yeah. Interesting story that I often tell. There's been a lot of fight. Anyone heard of this little startup called Amazon? Well, many of your communities were fighting over who was going to get their second headquarters over the past 2 years. And where did they end up? They ended up in Crystal City, Virginia. Well, what's interesting is when you look at Crystal City, Virginia, 4 of U.S. News and World Report's top 20 healthiest cities in the entire United States surround Crystal City, Virginia. Surround Crystal City, Virginia. That is not a coincidence. But what's also interesting, and we learned this from talking with your colleagues at the Federal Reserve, when you actually talk to businesses, they aren't intentionally, at least not to this point. They're starting to because of the opioid epidemic, but up to this point, they aren't moving because of health. They're moving, to your point, because of workforce. And so part of our challenge is helping folks understand that when you have transportation, when you have affordable housing, when you eliminate food deserts, when you have clean air laws, you're able to attract a young and educated workforce to your community and retain them there. And then that brings in businesses who bring in jobs. And those jobs can pay higher wages. Why? Because the number one cost for Fortune 500 companies is salary. The number 2 cost for most Fortune 500 companies is healthcare. It is literally bankrupting many of these companies, and workforce is a major problem. But there are traditional companies out there, and I won't call anyone out up here on stage because I don't want folks to feel like the Surgeon General was putting them on blast at the Aspen Ideas Festival. But there are major traditional U.S. companies who are looking to go overseas because they can't afford to stay in the towns where they're in because the diabetes rates are through the roof, because the smoking rates are through the roof. And so I want to understand from you, how do businesses, I mean, you went to Wharton, is this something that you were taught about in business school, or is this something, a place where we need to evolve in terms of the way we educate people to think about the number 2 cost?
Yeah. So first, let me applaud your emphasis in this area, because the societal determinants of health are so critically important. So I really applaud the efforts that you've brought to the service. In terms of, at Wharton, we had a healthcare management department focused on this. Besides that, you never thought about it, right? Other than your own, when it taught there for decades, your own health plan. That was it, right? That's the only way. I think this is the change that's happening right now. It's that we can no longer just forget what's happening. For example, one of the challenges of cities right now, and you've seen this, I'm sure, is gentrification. Gentrification, some cities will pat themselves on the back saying, yay, we're gentrified. But what happens to the gentrified? They don't just fall off the face of the earth. They have to go somewhere. And typically, the research shows that from our bank and elsewhere, they go to places where the healthcare service isn't as good, where the housing services aren't as good, where the job training programs aren't as good. They're getting pushed out of in the cities where these exist. We need to really emphasize inclusive growth.
We often say your zip code is more important than your genetic code in determining your health outcomes. I was in Chicago 2 weeks ago, and if you go 7 L stops, there is a 25-year difference in life expectancy 7 L stops away. There are communities all across America where literally 2 zip codes right next to each other will have a 20-plus year difference in life expectancy. And it's why you're hearing more folks talk about, as you mentioned, President Harker, the social determinants of health. But there's another important aspect of this, too. Businesses didn't talk about this at all. And then for the last couple of years, they've been leaning into worksite wellness programs. Right. And what's interesting is when you look at the studies, and you tell me if I'm wrong here, but I've talked to a lot of businesses, they aren't getting the return from a health outcome point of view on worksite wellness programs. Many of them tell me that they invest in worksite wellness programs because it's a recruiting tool, but not because it's actually improving outcomes. And here's why, in my opinion. You can do everything right from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. while you're on the job, but if you go home to an environment from 4 p.m. to 8 a.m. the next day where there's smoke all around you and you're not in smoke-free housing, where you don't have access to healthy food options, where there's not complete streets, or where it's not a safe neighborhood and you can't go out and be physically active.
Right.
There's no green spaces. It's going to undo everything that occurs from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. while you're on the job. And the other thing that people don't realize is that over half of the covered lives for most companies from an insurance point of view aren't the employees. They're the spouses and the children. So again, it's great that you have that cafeteria, that shiny new cafeteria with a salad bar, but that's only helping half of your covered lives when those individuals go home. So the thoughts on that, are you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the communities that people are coming from have to be healthy. It's not just the workplace has to be healthy. And again, we really need to emphasize inclusive growth. We cannot just push the problem to the side. Those days are gone for a couple of reasons. And the one, again, I'm optimistic about is that companies need those workers. Mm-hmm. They need to train these workers. They want to bring them into the economy. And so there is this virtuous cycle we can start to create if we're creative about it.
And the final point I'd make before we open it up for questions is that we also have to all collectively understand that health is so much more than health care. And you often hear that the U.S. spends more money on health care than anyone else in the world and has, quite frankly, pretty terrible outcomes to show for it. But when you actually include these social determinants of health, transportation, housing, a living wage, parental leave policies in your definition of health, we spend about as much money as Switzerland or the UK or Canada. It's just that we're spending 90% of our resources, our time, our talent, and our treasure on 10 to 20% of the problem, whereas they're spending it more evenly across the spectrum. And I think it's a challenge because we often tend to think of these social determinants of health as personal choices, individual things. We don't think of them as having a community impact, so we don't lean into them. But the challenge for me and what I'm trying to do in my CHEP report is to help folks understand that when there's a black boy in downtown Chicago without a dad who's a victim of violence, it's not just his problem. It's the community's problem because he's checking out of the workforce. He's becoming a disconnected youth who may go out there and commit a violent act on his own or break into someone's house. It's because we're losing that individual for the rest of his life. If he gets incarcerated, now, some of you have heard me tell this story if you were here last year. My baby brother Philip actually is in prison right now. He had unrecognized, untreated anxiety and depression. Self-medicated with alcohol, with tobacco, with marijuana, and then got a pill one day at a party, and that rapidly descended into heroin use, and stole $200 to support his habit, got a 10-year prison sentence. It cost about $100,000 a year to incarcerate someone in most places. You multiply that times the time he's going to be in prison, you're going to spend upwards of $500,000 to $1 million to incarcerate my brother. You all are, as taxpayers, versus using that money to invest in a diversion program for him, versus using that money to invest in mental health services for him, versus using it to invest in community resilience programs so that he had good people to hang out with and to be surrounded by instead of negative influences. And so I think it's important that we help folks understand that yes, there are individual choices, but the choices people make are 100% dependent on the choices that you put around them and the environment that they're living in. And if we invest in a better environment, make the healthy choice the easy choice, more people will start to make healthier and better choices, and it won't just help them, it helps all of us. Anything you want to add to that before we, please applaud to that, because I think that's important. Yeah. Anything you'd add before we open it up for questions?
Just amen.
All right. Yes, sir.
There are microphones coming.
And I didn't just pick him because he has the same haircut as me. Give him all the tough questions.
Well, it goes to this question. I think it's right to try to include what you're speaking of in infrastructure, but what people think of as infrastructure that's crumbling, we can't get that passed and supported. How do you include this in that? That's my first question. And my second question is for each of you, if you had to just talk about three things all the time, what would they be?
So in Philadelphia, we talk about our Super Bowl win because we may never have another one again. So.
Well, I'll go backwards. I'll tell you one of the things that I talk about all the time, and one is health equity. We often pat ourselves on the back for driving the averages down, when in many cases we're worsening disparities.
Right.
And one of my challenges, one of my goals, one of my missions is to help people see that health equity isn't about helping those people over there. It's about lifting us all up. Another one of the things, again, I talk about all the time is that health is important for all the other things you care about. And, you know, let me do this, because I do this in some audiences, but I think it's important. Even in this crowd, where folks are here because you care about health, you don't even prioritize health in your daily lives. Raise your hand if sometime in the last month you didn't get enough sleep, you skipped a meal, you skipped a workout, you ate an unhealthy meal for the sake of your job. And those of you who didn't raise your hand are lying. The fact is, we don't even prioritize health in our daily lives, but then we expect everyone else to prioritize health. And so I think it's important that we go out there and help folks understand the value of health to everything else that they do in their lives. And so,
yeah. So what I talk about is also the answer to a lot of the infrastructure issues.
yes.
We often wait for, particularly in this era, for either the Federal Reserve to steer the economy or the federal government to come up with a policy. First, we don't, the economy's you. The economy is real people doing real things. We just create the conditions for growth. You create growth. You create opportunity. You create equity, right, in our society. We just create, one interest rate is not going to solve all that. What I think we're seeing, and what I'm really excited about, is because we're unable to come up with policy solutions at the federal level, we are starting to see more action at the state and local levels, and even down to individual cities. So for example, in Philadelphia, Philadelphia has launched, along with the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and others, repair programs for houses. If you have a leaky roof, you have mold. If you have children in those houses, they're sick. And so CHOP has recognized this, the city has recognized this. So it's moving way upstream on the health issues. If you want to avoid that child showing up at CHOP ER, fix their house. Right? And that's the kind of things we're starting to see, that what we want to do through the Fed, through our bully pulpit at Fed, is highlight those issues, to do the research to show the efficacy of these programs, and to get the word out.
And thank you for that, because that's exactly where I was going to go with it. I know this is going to offend some people, but we can't rely on the federal government to save the day. Things have to be driven from the grassroots, from the ground up. And again, part of my initiative, my CHEP initiative, is about getting businesses on board. I would much rather have the CEO of the largest employer in my town show up at the State House or on Capitol Hill arguing for a health initiative or for infrastructure than to have the Surgeon General of the United States doing it. Because they already know what I'm going to say. And far too often, health is pitted against these other priorities, against business. Infrastructure is pitted against business. But I guarantee you, when Jeff Bezos shows up and says, I'm not going to move to your town unless you fix these bridges, these roads, unless you address this crumbling infrastructure, the city, every city across the country came up with infrastructure plans to try to court Amazon, didn't they? So we have to show folks that, again, we have to show businesses that it's up to them to lean into some of these policies. And again, we've got to have some of these grassroots-led initiatives. Yes, the federal government has a role, but rarely does the federal government come up with good policy in Washington, D.C. that fixes the problems all across the wide swath of the United States, considering the different cultures and sentiments and assets and needs of Aspen, Colorado versus Dallas, Texas versus Fort Wayne, Indiana versus Toledo, Ohio versus Boston, Massachusetts.
Yep.
Yes, ma'am. How are you? Buenos dias.
Mi nombre es Lourdes Rodriguez, and I want to thank you for a great conversation. I want to ask about public spaces. I think that great public spaces have a potential of building both health and wealth. So do you have any examples about how great public spaces across the U.S. are doing that, failing, and what can we do about it?
I love you for that question.
Well,
I love you for
right
that
back.
question, because I started off telling you that story about the U.S. Conference of Mayors, right? And the reason why I asked that question is because the two mayors sitting on either side of me have two of the most walkable cities in the United States, Columbia, South Carolina, and New York City. And they didn't do it to lower hemoglobin A1C rates. They didn't do it for health reasons. They did it because when you have walkable communities, more business goes downtown. Tax revenues go up. Housing values go up. It becomes a safer and more secure area because you've got 20 people on the street and they're less likely to be mugged than when you have one person walking down a dark alley in the middle of the night. So many great examples of that. Purpose-built communities, starting in East Lake, Georgia, that now are all over the United States. Blue zones, I was in Orlando just yesterday. Orlando is now starting up a blue zone. Why? Because Disney has leaned into worksite wellness programs as hard as they can. They are one of the best in the United States and the world at actually worksite wellness for their employees, and they're still going in the wrong direction because much of this is focusing on the 20% and not the 80%. So there are many examples out there, and that's what we're working on together. We're trying to help folks understand that there's a link, and then we're trying to provide them toolkits and examples from across the country of people who've invested in the social determinants of health, including public spaces. And again, not just because it improves health, but because it improves safety, security, economic prosperity.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is, and I'm sounding like a broken record, we need to make sure that the people living there are diverse economically, socially, because if you just push all those people out to even worse communities, yeah, we'll be proud of the park, but we're not helping solve the problem.
Amen, brother, and we're seeing that. I was actually hearing, last night I had dinner with a friend from San Francisco. Do you know the poverty rate for a family of 4 in San Francisco is now $140,000 a year? So what we've done, and you've got people who are mega commuting 3 hours each way to come in and work in San Francisco. So that is, you're so right. We've created these beautiful parks, these wonderful walkable communities, but we haven't baked in affordable housing into the equation, and we've just pushed people out. And again, we're worsening disparities, not shrinking them when we do that. Oh, back here with the microphone.
Good morning. You made a very important point about making healthy choices easy choices. When we think back on, inner city Baltimore, inner city Philadelphia, you think about the choices that are around the people who live there. And you've also talked about the importance of business owners and businesses advocating for good health. What and how can we incentivize healthier eating choices so that businesses are providing cheaper, affordable produce, meat, in supermarkets in those inner cities so that people can actually go and buy those, as opposed to the junk that's typically there, so easy to make.
Let me use the example of Camden, New Jersey. So Camden is going through a bit of a renaissance, lots of state support coming in. But in some communities still, the idea of city planning, urban planning, is still viewed as not a very good thing. Camden just opened. This is a city of over 70,000 people, very impoverished. They just opened their first supermarket in decades. There was another one supposed to open, but they walked away. So while we're prioritizing new businesses coming in, gleaming office towers, we need to plan and give incentives for a supermarket to show up. Because if the supermarket's not there, no matter how much we jawbone somebody to eat a healthy diet, they can't get the food.
And again, there's a role for all of us to play in here too. The obesity issue, it's tough. It's tough. You know what happened when schools changed their school lunches and gave kids all healthy foods? All the healthy foods ended up in the trash. You know what happens when we try to force supermarkets to carry healthier foods? A lot of that food rots on the shelves, and they end up not making money. So we have to help create an environment where more folks know about and are exposed to healthier foods. We have to consider the fact that a lot of folks don't have pots and pans and the ability to cook. A lot of folks don't know what a kumquat is. So, I've gone around and they have all these great programs where they're giving out bags of fruits and vegetables, and folks take them home and don't know how to cook them, don't even know what they are. We have to do health education from the ground up and combine it with policy from the top down so that we meet in the middle and create an environment where there's a demand. And a lot of that starts in the schools. So one great example that I've heard about over and over and over again are gardening programs in elementary schools. And when you do that and you introduce kids to all the variety of healthy foods out there and get them used to it from a young age, they go home to their parents and say, I want to cook some squash. I want to do this. And you slowly start to change the environment. But I just say that because it's respectfully simplistic to say that the federal government should, from a top down, or any government should, from a top down, go in and say, grocery store, you have to have all healthy food. Because again, no one's going to buy it. The grocery store is going to go out of business, and they're going to move out of that community. Many food deserts have actually been created because grocery stores aren't making money. And then they end up moving out and going somewhere else. And so it's a challenge, and it's a challenge that we're all trying to lean into, but it's going to take all of us working together and doing our part along the way to create that culture, that environment of healthy eating from the ground up. And then folks will do the right thing. I was actually talking with Indra Nooyi, who's the head of PepsiCo, also Frito-Lay, but they also have Quaker Oats. They've got many other and at the bottom line is her job to her shareholders is to make money. So we've got to create the environment where they can make money selling healthier products versus selling the unhealthy products, and they'll gladly cater to that. Sir? I like your vest, by the way. I want one of those.
Thank you. I'm sitting here, this is fascinating, by the way, and you're like the Obama of medicine. Okay. I'm a PhD clinical psychologist, and I deal with, and we provide service to large enterprises.
I'm still taking that in. Oh my gosh, that is an amazing, that's either an amazing compliment or
no,
terrible.
That's an amazing compliment.
Okay, thank you, because I didn't know which way you were coming from with that.
Okay, so
I'm a big fan, so thank you.
My world is changing behavior of large population. Can we pay people to live healthier? Can you monetize people to, for example, if you took 500 people and you said every month you weigh in, if you stay the same weight or lose weight, we're going to give you $100 a month or whatever it is. I've seen those programs have been highly successful, but speak on a larger framework.
I think there's carrots and there's sticks and there's still environment. And whether it's one of these guys that promotes friendly competition, or whether it's actually incentivizing people, paying people. Many worksite wellness programs do that. We'll pay you to quit smoking, or we'll penalize you if you don't smoke. And again, yes, that is a nudge in the right direction for those of you who know the concept of nudges. Right. But I can pay you $100, $200, $250 to quit smoking. If you go home to an environment where everyone around you is still smoking and you're inundated by it, that's going to have a bigger effect on your ability to quit smoking. Yes, and so it's the answer is yes, and it's not either or. But you're the finance expert.
The evidence in the behavioral economics field is mixed on this. There have been some successes, but many where there's been no real result. And it's not just in health. There's experiments going on, paying kids to get A's and B's, and again, some of that works, but the reality is, I'll agree with Dr. Adams. I mean, if you have this healthy environment, but everybody after work, whether in your community or your workers say, let's go to the beer garden and stay there for the next 4 hours, well, you just blew all that, right? So there's a cultural component to this. There's the places you live and that may be affected by this. The evidence is mixed. There have been some successes. I'm not saying there are none, but not all have been very successful.
I mean, if your friends, we can tell whether or not you're going to be obese or whether or not you're going to smoke or how long you're going to live by your friends. Right. I would much rather, to answer your question more directly, if I had $1 million to invest, I'd rather invest it in changing the environment in a community or around an individual than investing it in trying to give every person a financial incentive to do the right thing. Because the other thing we've learned from behavioral economics, and you know this as a psychologist, is when the incentives go away, the behavior goes back to what it was before. And you know this, I actually have a degree in psychology.
If you change the behavior, you change the complexion of the community organically too. So.
Exactly. And so the answer is really it's both. But you're going to get not as much bang for your buck if you aren't looking at the environment.
And this is where, what I'd say is, experimentation is important here, and careful experimentation, not just winging it. So for example, one of my old colleagues, Barbara Kahn, who's in the marketing department at Wharton, she and her colleagues at Annenberg have done work over the years on health communications and health marketing. And for example, you walk into a restaurant and there's the calorie count, right? The 3 sizes, you go, they have salads. That'd be good. I'll have the Big Mac. And psychologically, what they found is people think, well, I thought about the salad, so I'm a better person. You know, I thought about it, but I'm still going to eat the Big Mac. So until we do serious experimentation and research on these ideas, I'm skeptical about just rolling them out across the board.
I love that you said that, because we have policymakers in this audience. And one of the things that we do miserably from a policy point of view is evaluation. We have these great ideas all across the United States, and we put in a policy to try it out, but there's never an intentional plan up front to evaluate, and we don't course correct when we don't never even notice that we're not getting the results, and we don't course correct to adjust when we find out we're not getting the benefits that we thought we were getting. So critically important that evaluation is part of this process. And I want to talk about, so we got 6 minutes left. I want to talk about one other thing, and again, we'll have time for more questions, but this one is particularly important to me, especially here in Aspen. I'm very, very concerned as Surgeon General at how far and how fast we're going on marijuana in this country. I'm very concerned. You know, number one, this isn't your mother's marijuana. Marijuana a decade ago was 5% THC. Single digits THC. You now have professionally grown strains that are 20, 30% THC, and then they're concentrating them into oils, into waxes. They're vaping them, they're dabbing them, they're shatter, and you're getting 90, 95% THC. It's like the difference between you having a glass of wine and a pint of grain alcohol. It literally is. And so we've normalized this idea of marijuana use across the country way too fast, to the point that in communities in California, there's 1 in 5 pregnant women, 20% of pregnant women reporting that they are using marijuana during pregnancy. Youth attitudes are changing about marijuana across the country. And I want you to hear me say this as the nation's doctor. There is no such thing as medical marijuana. And I see some eyebrows raised out there. We don't talk about medical foxglove. We don't talk about medical opium. There is no other substance out there that, as a physician, we say grow it in your backyard, crumble it up, bake it into a brownie, or roll it into a cigarette and smoke it, and that's going to be good for whatever ails you. There are over 100 components of marijuana, some of them which have medicinal properties and medicinal promise, and we need to make sure we push for the research so that we can say to each individual, this component has been proven to be beneficial for your disease, and here are the risks and the benefits. But I think we have to have the courage to have a more nuanced conversation, particularly with so many folks out there coming out in favor of legalization with an election coming up. And from a social justice point of view, I'm terribly concerned about the injustice, the fact that black men are 4 times as likely to be arrested as white men for marijuana usage. But you already have a liquor store and a smoke shop on every corner in every black community. I don't know that adding a marijuana dispensary to that mix is going to fix all our social justice ills. And right here in Colorado, I've talked to some of your police chiefs who are saying that, so here's the problem. The problem isn't the law that marijuana is illegal. The problem is, from a social justice point of view, is racism and bias. And so what they've seen is that now, instead of your 21-year-old black men getting arrested for using marijuana, now your 17-year-old black boys are getting arrested at disproportionate rates for using marijuana, because it wasn't, the legalization wasn't the problem, it was the racism and bias within communities. So I wanted to mention that, and then I wanted to kick it back to you, because from a business point of view, well, I was talking with the head of the Defense Health Agency just the other day, and I've talked to the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force Surgeons General. What do you do now as a business and when you're in a community where marijuana is legal, but you've got to get people to drive forklifts? Or when you're giving people guns and sending them out to fight, and they're coming from communities where marijuana is legal, and again, where you've got these super potent strains. So are you all talking about that, thinking about that?
I mean, our world is a serious issue because states have legalized it, but under federal law, banks cannot bank those businesses and ancillary businesses. So it's not just the marijuana dispensary or the place that's growing the marijuana, it's the warehouse owner. You can't bank that owner if the majority of their income or a substantial portion of their income is coming from marijuana growing. So where's that money going? It's not going into federally chartered banks. And so it is raising issues about the stability, the financial stability of a fast-growing business. Second, though, is the issue that you raised about some employers are just, if it's not a forklift operator, they're just relaxing. And I think not only have we gotten
No pun intended.
no pun intended. We're not only gotten ahead of this issue, as you mentioned, in a variety of ways, but for example, I used to work for the director of the FBI a long time ago. We don't really, if you're a cop on the beat, you know, and if you think somebody's drunk, you have a breathalyzer. What do you do if you think somebody's high? It's a clinical diagnosis, essentially, right? Because you have no reliable technology, right, on the street to diagnose, not diagnose this person, but to decide whether they're over the limit or not. We don't even have a concept of over the limit in these communities. So we're hearing from a lot of the local communities that are being hit by this. They said, we don't know what to do on the banking side. We don't know what to do from the law enforcement side because we don't have this technology.
And I just think the lesson for us is we need to proceed with a little more caution and not think that blanket legalization is going to provide a net public health benefit or a net social justice benefit or a net medical and clinical benefit across the board. We need to do more research, and we need to not think that legalization is the salvation for all of our ills. Maybe time for, yes, ma'am?
Thank you very much. Good morning. Jenny Joseph, Common Sense Childbirth. I just want to bring the mothers into the room. Without women, without mothers, we have nothing.
I agree.
Right? And so I wonder if either of you would address the maternal health care crisis, the maternal mortality crisis, the fact that in the USA, we are of the worst amongst developed nations for our maternal child health outcomes. And what are we going to do about that?
The U.S. is the only developed nation where maternal mortality rates are going up instead of down. As your Surgeon General, I am very concerned about this, and I'm actually working with the CDC and HRSA right now, and my hope is to put out a call to action sometime this winter on maternal mortality, helping communities understand their role, helping hospitals understand their role. Because the other thing about maternal mortality is a college-educated, a PhD holding black woman is more likely to die during or within a year of childbirth than a white woman who dropped out of high school. There are a few other diseases out there where the disparities are so clear and so clearly traced back to race and bias within our communities. And yes, it's something I'm terribly concerned about and I'm going to be leaning into.
Yep.
Thoughts on that?
Amen.
All right, I think we are out of time, but please engage with both of us on Twitter and on social media. Thank you for spending a little bit of your Sunday morning with us.
Thank you.